Kodak. We know it for its cameras, its film, and those iconic yellow boxes that captured our most precious memories, but even more so for being an American icon of innovation and industry. But as we'll see in this video, American patriotism and corporate interests do have a dark side. For during World War II, Kodak maintained secret business relationships with Nazi Germany that helped their enemies develop crucial photographic technology. And since the war ended, we've uncovered the reality of just how far the biggest corporations were willing to go to protect their profits. While Kodak never had the military ambitions of the great powers fighting across Europe and the Pacific, they did have a very keen sense for global market dominance, which is why they steadily developed international partnerships and subsidiaries that protected their business interests across the world. In their corporate situation, this made a lot of sense, since Kodak also practiced a policy of aggressive expansion to protect their monopoly and their profits. This means establishing factories in foreign countries and maintaining business relationships, regardless of political circumstances. It is a testament to their business acumen that Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in America by the time war broke out in Europe. So, when World War II saw American companies forced to choose between patriotism and profit, Kodak took very calculated steps to maintain their global empire, at one time operating factories in Nazi Germany, even as American soldiers were dying on European battlefields. The company prevented neither technology transfers nor patent sharing with their German subsidiaries, and anybody questioning these arrangements found themselves facing powerful corporate lawyers and carefully crafted denials. At the time, many American corporations were quietly doing business with the enemy, but Kodak also received surprisingly little scrutiny about their international business practices and foreign partnerships. They were willing to continue sharing patents and to do business through neutral intermediaries, including with Nazi Germany. Now, after the Great Depression devastated the American economy, corporations were struggling to maintain their market share. That is, until the war economy began ramping up in the late 1930s and companies found new opportunities for profit. Kodak's plan was to maintain their technological superiority, both in the American market and the international markets they had cultivated, a task that required maintaining their German operations at all costs. Supposedly, the German subsidiary was operating independently, intending to serve only the civilian population and commercial interests after hostilities began. And yet the immense value of photographic technology for military purposes proved way too tempting, and so Kodak's innovations were funneled off to help the Nazi war effort. It's estimated that Kodak's German subsidiary, known as Kodak AG, employed thousands of workers throughout the war, many of them forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners, all in an effort to maintain production. This number is hard to finalize because besides the main factory, there were also smaller operations, subcontractors, and supply chains. Now, just having a factory in Germany is one thing if you're actually being forced to operate it, but that wasn't Kodak's situation at all. In order to actually maintain control, the American parent company had to get creative. They began routing communications through neutral countries like Switzerland and maintaining ownership stakes through complex corporate structures, the most important of which was their relationship with Wilhelm Kepler, a prominent Nazi official and economic advisor to Hitler himself. In 1933, the same year Hitler rose to power, Kodak became even more aggressive, changing their strategy from simple international business to active collaboration with the Nazi regime. Now, keep in mind that none of these actions were completely hidden. American intelligence agencies were somewhat aware of the corporate entanglements with Germany. And yet, despite the obvious conflict of interest, Kodak, in an effort to maintain market dominance, continued operating their German factories and sharing technology. The company stubbornly resisted any claim they were acting favorably towards the Nazis, but the reality was very different. American corporations like Ford and IBM ignored the moral implications and continued operating as if everything was business as usual. Of course, there was plenty of actual profit motive going on at Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York at the time. The executives who controlled Kodak's international operations carefully maintained their German assets even as American boys were being drafted to fight overseas. The official company policy during this time was to actively protect their patents and market share in Germany, even if it meant those same technologies were being used against Allied forces. In 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, Kodak was still maintaining business relationships with their German subsidiary and ensuring that technological advances flowed both ways across the Atlantic, all the while claiming they had no control over what happened in Nazi-occupied territory. Now, to be fair, most American consumers at the time had no idea of these connections to the Nazis, but the executives, board members, and government liaisons could claim no ignorance. Luckily for them, the world was too busy battling with Hitler's forces to fully investigate corporate collaboration. But after the war ended in 1945, the global attention turned towards those American companies that had maintained operations in the Third Reich. Allied investigators, acting on behalf of justice and accountability, demanded that companies like Kodak explain their wartime activities and the use of slave labor in their factories. The company resisted at first, of course, but mounting evidence forced them to acknowledge that their German subsidiary had indeed used forced labor from concentration camps. An international investigation revealed that Kodak AG had employed workers from the Auschwitz concentration camp and other labor camps throughout the war. That investigation, however, only saw limited accountability and minimal compensation paid to survivors. In 1999, a class action lawsuit was filed against Kodak and dozens of other American and European companies that had used slave labor during the Holocaust, and after years of legal battles, the findings were staggering. Kodak's German operations had employed hundreds of forced laborers, but the company had never paid reparations or even formally acknowledged their suffering. The lawsuit eventually led to the creation of a German foundation funded by German companies and the German government that saw over $5 billion set aside to compensate former slave laborers around the world, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Several companies like Ford, General Motors, IBM, and Kodak, as well as numerous German corporations, participated in that settlement. Kodak also made contributions to Holocaust education programs as a token gesture of corporate responsibility for their wartime activities. Of course, there are many who still aren't happy with the way American corporations handled their Nazi collaborations and the subsequent accountability. The companies, critics claim, haven't fully acknowledged the extent of their cooperation with the Nazi regime or the profits they made from slave labor. Unfortunately, there is no acceptable figure of how much profit Kodak extracted from their German operations during the war, built on the backs of people who had no choice but to work or die. Corporate neutrality, as Kodak learned, has its price, and yet at the end of the day it seems to have been a small one compared to the profits. To this day, Kodak's legacy remains complicated by these revelations, though the company has largely faded from its former dominance in the photography market. The digital revolution eventually accomplished what wartime accountability never could, bringing down the empire that Kodak had built on global market control at any cost. In any case, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to subscribe. We're gonna hear each other again soon, and until then, stay smart.